Hello, welcome to OJ Studios. Please enjoy today's chapter of Ghost by Olivia Julius. The faint sound of a key turning in the lock stirred me from the restless fog I'd drifted into. It wasn't sleep, I wasn't sure ghosts could sleep, but it was something like it, a haze of thoughts so heavy they almost drowned out the world around me. Almost. The door creaked open, and I turned instinctively toward the sound. It was my landlord, Mr. Patel. He was a short, wiry man with graying hair and a perpetually furrowed brow. I'd only ever talked to him about late rent or plumbing issues, but now he looked somber, his eyes darting nervously around the apartment as though he didn't belong here. Behind him were two people I'd never expected to see in my space, my parents. My mother walked in first, clutching a tissue in one hand and holding onto my father's arm with the other. Her face was red and blotchy, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked around the room. My father followed close behind, his jaw tight, his eyes glassy but dry. He looked like he was holding himself together by sheer willpower, trying to stay strong for her. I froze, or at least, I felt frozen. The sight of them in my apartment hit me harder than anything I'd experienced since waking up as this. My mom's sobs filled the silence. This was his home, she whispered, her voice trembling as she took in the cluttered space, the little pieces of my life scattered everywhere. My dad nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. Yeah, he said quietly, his voice gruff. It was. Mr. Patel hesitated by the door, clearly unsure if he should stay. I'll, leave you to it, he said awkwardly, stepping back into the hallway. Take as much time as you need. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving my parents alone in the apartment. I stayed where I was, hovering near the window, unsure what to do. Could they sense me? Could they feel that I was still here, watching them? Part of me wanted to call out to them, to tell them I was okay, or, at least, not completely gone. But I knew it wouldn't work. My mom walked over to the couch, her fingers brushing the throw blanket I'd left there. She picked it up, holding it close to her chest like it was some priceless treasure. He always loved this stupid thing, she said, a sad smile breaking through the tears. My dad sat down on the edge of the coffee table, his hands clasped tightly together. Yeah, he said again, his voice thick with emotion. He did. I floated closer, my chest aching in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. Seeing them like this, broken, grieving, made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. I wasn't just dead. I was gone. And they were left to pick up the pieces. My mom turned toward the kitchen, her eyes settling on the coffee mug I'd left on the counter. She walked over and picked it up, cradling it in her hands. It's like he's still here, she said softly. I wanted to scream, I am here. I'm right here. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched as my dad stood up, his hands trembling as he placed them on her shoulders. He wouldn't want us to fall apart, he said, his voice cracking. We need to be strong. For him. She nodded, but the tears didn't stop. I felt utterly helpless, more so than I had at any point since I'd died. I wanted to comfort them, to tell them I loved them, to let them know I was still me, but all I could do was watch. The weight of their grief was suffocating, even in my ghostly form. It settled in the room like a heavy fog, filling every corner, every space. As they stood there, holding each other in the middle of my cluttered apartment, I realized something: this wasn't just about me anymore. My death wasn't just my own tragedy. It had rippled out, touching the lives of the people who loved me, tearing holes in their world just as it had in mine. And somehow, I had to make it right. After what felt like hours, my parents finally left. My mom took one last, long look around the apartment, clutching that blanket like it was the only thing tying her to me. My dad guided her out gently, his hand on her back, his steps slow and heavy. I stayed behind, watching the door close, the soft click echoing in the now empty apartment. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and unbearable. I couldn't take it anymore. I drifted through the door, moving like a breeze down the staircase and out into the street. The sun was high now, the city alive with its usual noise and motion. Cars honked, people chatted on the sidewalks, a bus rumbled past. It was a normal day for everyone else, even though my world had been shattered. I floated aimlessly for a while, not sure where I was going or what I was looking for. The ache of seeing my parents was still fresh, and I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. But I needed to do something, anything. That's when I saw her. She was about my age, maybe a little younger, walking alone down the sidewalk. She had her hands stuffed in the pockets of an oversized jacket, her headphones in, bobbing her head slightly to the beat of whatever she was listening to. Her expression was neutral, maybe a little bored, as she weaved through the other pedestrians. I don't know why I picked her. Maybe it was because she looked like she had somewhere to go. Maybe it was because she reminded me of myself, just another young person trying to get through the day. Or maybe I just wanted to feel alive again. I moved closer, letting instinct take over. It was easier now, I didn't even have to think about it. As I leaned into her, my ghostly form sank into her body like stepping through a doorway. The transition was smooth, almost seamless.
Suddenly I was in. Her body felt strange, foreign but familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Her hands were small, her frame lighter than mine had been, her movements subtly different. The faint buzz of her headphones filled my ears now, the bass vibrating softly against her chest. I flexed her fingers experimentally, clenching them into fists and releasing them. They obeyed me just like the others had. I glanced down at her reflection in a shop window as I walked past, seeing her face instead of mine. Her wide eyes, her slightly flushed cheeks. It was unsettling. But it worked. I adjusted her jacket and kept walking, trying to blend in with the crowd. For a moment, I let myself enjoy the feeling of being real again. The weight of her steps, the rhythm of her breathing, the rush of cold air against her face. It was all so vivid, so tangible. But the deeper I sank into her body, the more questions gnawed at the back of my mind. What was I doing? What was the point of this? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back to my apartment and wait for nothing. I needed to keep moving. I needed to feel alive, even if it wasn't really me living. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find a way to make sense of all this. As I settled deeper into her body, something unexpected happened. It started as a faint tug at the edges of my awareness, like catching snippets of a distant conversation. Flashes of thoughts, emotions, and images that didn't belong to me began to surface. First, I tried to push them aside, unsure of what was happening. But then I focused, and suddenly it was like a door had opened. Her memories. They were hers, and yet somehow I could see them, feel them. She had just gotten off work. She worked at a coffee shop not too far from here, and the last few hours had been a blur of steaming lattes, impatient customers, and the hum of an espresso machine. I could feel the exhaustion in her body, the soreness in her feet from standing all day. She was heading home now, her routine so familiar it was almost automatic. She lived nearby, just a few blocks away, in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. And she lived alone. The realization hit me like a jolt. I wasn't sure why it mattered, but it felt significant. Maybe it was because I knew what it was like to live alone, to come home to silence and solitude at the end of the day. Her name floated to the surface of my mind, Jessica. I said it out loud, or at least I tried to. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was a strange disconnect, like I was speaking from behind a curtain. I shook her head, trying to clear the haze of thoughts that weren't mine. The memories were still there, swirling in the background, but I forced myself to focus. Jessica's feet kept moving, carrying us down the familiar streets toward her apartment. The weight of her bag bounced lightly against her side, the sound of her sneakers soft against the pavement. I didn't know why I was still in her body. I hadn't meant to stay this long. But something about her life, her routine, felt oddly grounding. Like if I could just follow her steps, I'd figure out what I was supposed to do next. Or maybe I was just running from my own emptiness. As Jessica's feet carried me up the stairs to her apartment, her memories continued to seep into my mind, unbidden but vivid. Her after-work routine unfolded in flashes, small, familiar rituals that seemed so normal, so human. It was like watching someone else's life play out in fragments, except I wasn't just watching. I was living it. The weight of her keys in her hand. The way she jiggled the old lock to get the door open. The creak of the hinges as she stepped inside. It was all so mundane, but for me it was overwhelming. The sense of normalcy was almost intoxicating after everything I'd been through. I let her body move on autopilot, following the rhythm of her routine as it played out in her mind. She dropped her bag by the door, kicked off her sneakers, and shrugged out of her jacket, tossing it onto a chair. Her small apartment was cozy, cluttered in a way that felt lived in, a soft throw on the couch, a stack of books on the coffee table, a faintly burning candle on the kitchen counter. And then, almost without realizing it, I was standing in her bedroom. Her hands reached up, pulling her shirt over her head in one smooth motion. The cool air brushed against her skin, and I felt a flicker of discomfort, not hers but mine. This isn't right. But her body kept moving, her memories guiding me forward like a script I couldn't deviate from. Her hands reached behind her back, unclasping her bra and letting it fall away. I turned her head, catching a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror, her bare shoulders, her collarbone, the faint lines of exhaustion etched into her face. I froze for a moment, the reality of what I was doing crashing over me. What am I doing? But Jessica's memories tugged me onward, and before I could stop myself, her feet carried me into the bathroom. She turned the faucet, filling the tub with warm water and pouring in a generous amount of bubble bath. The faint scent of lavender filled the small space, and steam rose in soft curls, fogging the mirror. I tried to pull back, to stop, but it was like being caught in a current. Her body wasn't mine, but her habits, her memories, her life, they were pulling me deeper and deeper. As the water filled the tub, I sank down onto the edge, her hands brushing against her thighs. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the swirling bubbles, the heat of the room wrapping around me like a blanket. And then I realized I wasn't just living her routine. I was losing myself in it. Panic surged through me. I stood abruptly, her body reacting to my will for the first time since this had started. The disconnect between me and her routine shattered, leaving me standing there, breathing hard even though I didn't need to breathe. I looked around the bathroom, the tile walls closing in on me, the scent of lavender almost suffocating. This wasn't my life. This wasn't my body. I had to get out. Now. I started to pull back, to leave Jessica's body and return to the cold, empty void of my ghostly form. The same sensation I'd felt before, the loosening of a grip, the strange tug of separation, began to stir in me. Her body was still, her thoughts unaware, like she had no idea someone else was even here, sharing her every move. But then I stopped. I hovered on the edge of leaving her, the thought creeping into my mind, she doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't feel it. What would a few more hours hurt? Jessica's life felt so tangible, so real. I could feel the warmth of the bathroom, the soft bubbles brushing against her skin as her hands tested the water's temperature. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside her apartment, smell the lavender that lingered in the air. It was better, so much better, than the nothingness waiting for me if I left her. Another night as a ghost. The thought made me shudder. Floating aimlessly in silence, unable to touch anything, unable to feel anything. Right now, I was stuck in a woman's body. Her hands weren't mine, her face wasn't mine, but at least I was here. At least I was alive. I stepped back from the edge of leaving her, letting myself settle back into her body. Her routine called to me again, familiar and comforting in its simplicity. I let her sink into the warm water of the tub, her muscles relaxing as the heat enveloped her. Her mind drifted, and for a moment so did mine. The warmth of the water, the soothing scent of lavender, it was almost enough to make me forget who I was. Almost. But somewhere in the back of my mind a voice whispered, "This isn't your life." I ignored it. Just a few more hours. That's all it would be. And for now I let myself stay. After the bath, Jessica's body moved on autopilot again, guided by the flow of her routine. I dried her off, slipped on a pair of soft flannel pajamas, and sat cross-legged on her bed. The faint hum of her apartment, the heater clicking on, the distant murmur of the TV in the neighbor's place, filled the quiet. It was peaceful, normal. But I couldn't ignore the growing weight in my mind. What comes next? I couldn't stay in Jessica forever. Her life didn't leave room for the kind of freedom I needed. She had a job that kept her grounded, a modest income that would make anything long-term difficult, and a routine that didn't allow for the kind of drastic changes I'd need to make if I was going to track down my murderer. I stared down at her hands, flexing her fingers thoughtfully. I'd stumbled into her life by accident, but now I had to think bigger. I needed someone with resources, someone who could give me the tools to dig into my death, money, power, connections. And that's when the idea struck me. Alan Yates. Everyone in the city knew his name. The billionaire tech tycoon who owned half the skyline. His face was plastered across magazines and TV screens. If I could possess him, I could use his wealth and influence to dig into my murder. Hire private investigators. Bribe the right people. Maybe even pull strings with the police. But as quickly as the idea came, reality slammed into me like a freight train. Yates wasn't just rich, he was busy. His life was a whirlwind of board meetings, press events, and jet-setting to exotic locations. I could already feel the exhaustion of trying to maintain a life like that, trying to keep up the illusion that I was him. There'd be too many moving pieces, too many people who'd notice if something was off. I needed something simpler. And then another idea hit me, one that made my stomach twist in ways I didn't think were possible for a ghost. Yates had kids. 2 of them, to be exact, a boy and a girl, both teenagers. They were often in the tabloids, photographed at private schools or charity galas. If I possessed one of them, I wouldn't have to deal with the chaos of Yates's life directly. I could live quietly on the sidelines, accessing their family's wealth and resources without being the center of attention. But as quickly as I thought it, doubt crept in. Is it ethical to possess a kid? Question churned in my mind, heavy and suffocating. They were innocent, completely unaware of my situation with their whole lives ahead of them. Could I really steal that away, even temporarily? And what if I got stuck? What if I took too much and left them hollow, broken? I sat in Jessica's body, staring at the blank wall in her bedroom as the weight of it all sank in. The idea felt wrong, but at the same time it felt like my only shot. If I didn't figure out who killed me, I'd be stuck like this forever, wandering, empty, nothing. No. I shook her head. I couldn't decide now. I'd think it through, weigh my options. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stay in Jessica. Tomorrow morning I'd leave her body. I owed her that much. For now I let her drift into sleep, feeling her heartbeat slow, her breath even out. It wasn't my body, but it was comforting in a way. As I sat there in the quiet, I made a promise to myself. Whatever came next, I'd find a way to make this right. I'd find my killer. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find a way to move on.